Seveso disaster when the poison fell from the sky. What happened in Seveso on July 10, 1976, 12:37 p.m. Normal Saturday afternoon in northern Italy. Children were playing outside, families were having lunch, farmers were working in their fields, and then a white cloud rose into the sky and not smoke from a fire, not steam from a mission, poison. That happened in Meda, a small town of Seveso, inside a chemical plant called ICMESA. Something went terribly wrong. Within minutes, a toxic cloud drifted southwest, slowly settling over homes, gardens, farms, covering 18 square kilometers in a fine white powder. This was not just a chemical leak. This was the highest civilian exposure in history to one of the most toxic substances ever studied, TCDD dioxin. The disaster later earned a chilling nickname, Italian's Hiroshima. How did the routine reaction turn into a catastrophe? For this, you need to think logically. The factory was producing a chemical 2,4,5-trichlorophenol. Cosmetics and pharmaceutical dioxin was not the main product, it was a byproduct, and it forms only when the temperature crosses safe limits. Now, here's where the negligence begins because Italian law restricted weekend chemical production. The process was stopped midway on Saturday morning. Only 50% of the solvent has been distilled, and the final steps, adding water to cool the mixture, was never completed. The reactor was left without stirring, without cooling, without a temperature alarm, without an automatic shutdown system. Let that sink in. A chemical reactor handling toxic compounds left unattended. Even though heating was turned off, the reactor walls remained extremely hot, nearly 300 degrees Celsius without stirring. Heat concentrated to the top layer of the mixture. Temperature crossed 180 degrees Celsius. The scientists called a runaway exothermic reaction. The safety rupture disk burst and the toxic vapor shot directly into the atmosphere. No filters, no containment dome, just a roof vent. The cloud rose 60 feet into the air and then it drifted over people's lives. Silence that followed. Now here's the part that makes the worst. For these companies downplayed it. They told authorities that it probably was a herbicide cloud, something that might damage crops, nothing serious. It just took 7 days until July 17 for them to admit PCB. The dioxin was present. 7 days and evaluation on July 26, 2 weeks later. Imagine living in a containmented area, eating vegetables from your garden, letting your children play outside, completely unaware. This wasn't just a chemical failure. There's a communication failure and an ethical failure. An invisible enemy is dioxin and why it's so dangerous. Let's understand the real villain here. Dioxins are what scientists call as a persistent organic pollutants. That means they don't break down easily, not in the soil and the water. Not in the human body. The TCDD considered one of the most toxic chemicals ever studied. Some estimates suggest a single ounce could kill 1 million people. Not whether that exact number is debated. What is not debated is it's extremely toxic. Why it's so dangerous? First, it's fat soluble. Accumulate in the body. Fat not flushed out easily. In humans, in half-life 7 to 9 years, it will stay in their body. Which means that if you are exposed to today, half of it may still be inside your body nearly a decade later. Second, it bioaccumulates. It moves up food chain, contaminated grasses eaten by the animals, stored in fats, consumed by humans back. And that's how the entire ecosystems become toxic. Nearly 200 cases of the chloracnes are recorded, mostly in children. Chloracne is not ordinary acne. It causes painful, push-fill lesions. Nearly 200 cases of chlorine were recorded, mostly in children. Chlorine is not an ordinary acne. It causes painful, pus-fill lesions. It can last for years, and that was just a visible damage. Long-term studies over 40 years found increased risk of non-Hodgkin lymphopenia, leukemia, dose-related increase in breast cancer, permanent damage to the semen quality in the boys exposed before puberty, increased infertility in women, earlier menopause. This is what long-term chemical exposure looks like. Not dramatic like explosions, but slow, persistent integration in environmental devastation. More than 80,000 animals either died or were slaughtered, not because they were sick immediately, but to prevent the toxin from entering the food chain. Over 200,000 cubic meters of containment soil had been removed, buried in the massive Lincoln pit. Think it's like a whole landscape scrapped away. Today, the site is covered by Seveso Oak Forest Park, peaceful, green, quiet park. Beneath it lies a buried chemical memory. Seveso was not just an accident; it was a turning point. Because from the tragedy came the Seveso directives, strict European industrial safety laws, mandatory risk assessments, public right to know laws, emergency planning requirements. Europe learned the lesson is has the rest of the world because chemicals haven't disappeared, factories haven't disappeared, and negligence that never disappears on its own. It has to be regulated. Children continued playing in the contaminated gardens. Families ate vegetables grown in the poisoned soil. Nobody knew that evacuation of the most of the contaminated areas, Zone A, did not begin until July 26. More than 2 weeks after the toxic cloud fell, symptoms had already started. The children were the first to show visible damage. Painful skin eruptions, pus-filled lessons can last for years, sometimes decades. Imagine being a parent, watching your child's skin deteriorate and not knowing why. The ethics question here is what makes it worse? The record suggested that the parent company, Hoffman La Roche, had known for years that this reactor design was dangerous and there had already been similar industrial accidents. Germany in 1958, Netherlands 1963. Productions were well documented, yet the plant operated in a densely populated area without a proper alarm system, without emergency. So the question is, was this ignorance or was this the calculated risk? Within hours of the cloud passing, animals began dying, and then rabbits, chickens, pets, some were found bleeding from the mouth. The toxins were already entering the food chain. Authorities faced a brutal decision to prevent dioxin from spreading through the meat and dairy. They ordered an emergency slaughter. 1978, over 800,000 animals were killed, or else that would have collapsed the entire ecosystem. Agriculture was banned in the containment zone. More than 4,000 kitchen gardens were abandoned for small farming families. It wasn't just about containment, it was economic destruction, livelihood erased, the cleanup operation. The decontamination was massive. Over 200,000 cubic meters of toxic soil and debris were removed. That's equivalent of thousands of truckloads. That base was buried in two giant concrete-lined underground basins designed to contain the poison at least 300 years, which means 3 centuries. That's how long the consequences last. So who took the responsibility? Now let's talk about it. In 1983, 5 company officials were convicted. Sentence ranged from 2.5 to 5 years, but after appeals, only 2 were found guilty, and even then the sentence was suspended. No prison time served. Compensation of Hoffman La Roche eventually paid damages, estimates around $168 million to $240 million. Our cleanup, housing, compensations. But here's a deeper shift. The disaster forced experts to rethink industrial accidents. It wasn't human error, it was organizational failure, cost cutting pressures, weak safety systems, lack of investment risk management. The problem wasn't one technician, it was the entire system. And from the tragedy to the transformation, there was a directives. Here's where the Seveso changed history. In 1982, the European community enacted the Seveso directive. For the first time, chemical safety became proactive, not reactive. What changes? Mandatory safety management systems, the detailed risk assessments. Companies legally required to identify possible side reactions, regular reporting to authorities, and most importantly, the public right to know. Communities must now be informed about the nearby hazardous plants. Emergency procedures must be transparent because information saves lives, and this has been updated multiple times. Today, it is known as Seveso 3. It reshaped European industrial safety culture. And why it matters today is that was 1976, but here's why Seveso still matters. Today, chemical plants are even more complex. Global supply chains, outsourced contractors, advanced technologies, complexity increases risk. The Seveso framework addresses that through the layered safety system. Seveso versus the Bhopal Seveso is compared to Bhopal. Both involve toxic chemicals here, and both exposed the civilians. One led to the rapid regulatory reform across Europe, the other revealed how developing nation often lacks the enforcement power. That contrast is uncomfortable because industrialization is accelerating globally, and not every country has a Seveso level framework safety. So teaches as something more important is disaster don't just test technology, it is transparency. There is accountability where the profit comes before the people. The factory is gone today, the site is quiet forest park, but beneath the green surface lies the very toxic memory. A reminder that regulation is not anti-development, it's protection. Because without strict oversight, history doesn't just repeat itself, it upgrades itself.